thing that claims that it is high quality is probably not that. Mm-hmm. So I think we have a problem, gents, with the title of our podcast. But that's a topic for another day.
Welcome to The Art of Quality. Today's episode is a bit different. We're looking back at 2025. In fact, my co-hosts Willie, John, and Paul are, as I unfortunately wasn't able to attend. So instead, I recorded this short intro to get you fired up for this wonderful 50 minutes ahead of you. They are full of stories from this year's guests, as well as reflections on our own lived experiences on this joint quest to get closer to quality. Quality has repeatedly been referred to as something that is hard to pin down, but you know it when you experience it, when you come into relationship with it. One highlight for me is an observation across many of our conversations, that all our guests share wisdom born out of practice, not theory. Another way to say this, in John's words, is that success is iterative. He was able to observe this firsthand when traveling to Geneva, where he met with some of the world's oldest watchmakers and learned through their stories how iteration has allowed them to endure for more than 500 years. Listen to 2 episodes with Eric Markowitz for more stories on this. Paul's conversation with bass guitarist Victor Wooten in mid-August also illustrates this principle of iteration wonderfully, as does the episode we recorded on quality in nature in July, where we observed that nature itself is really a trillion iterations of experiments running at any given time. What makes me so excited about the Art of Quality project is how deeply practical it can be for our own lived experience. It's a huge privilege to be on this journey together with you, with Willie, John, and Paul, and of course, our producer Darian. And before we dive into the episode, Darian, I'd like to ask you, how was the journey for you so far?
Thanks so much for asking. I completely agree. It's been a real privilege to work and learn alongside John, Willie, Paul, and you. The support from all of you played a big role in me leaning fully into exploring storytelling and production, and ultimately in deciding to pursue a master's degree in content production. What I particularly enjoy is that iteration, which you already mentioned, we see as a building block in the pursuit of quality, is something we learn from our conversations with investors, builders, artists, etc. And then we directly apply it in how we produce the show. Our intro melody is a good example for this. We started with a generic track. It helped us move forward, but especially after our conversation with Guillermo Rosenthaler on the quality of the voice, it became clear we'd outgrown it. Working and talking to Guillermo taught us a lot about authenticity and about his craft of finding the unique inner voice through playfulness and songs. He composed and recorded our current intro and lent his strong voice to it, giving the show a melody that feels timeless, playful, and closer to what we're trying to express.
It's a wonderful story. So let's now dive into this episode.
A very warm welcome to our listeners for this special episode of The Art of Quality. We have 3 of our hosts here today. The 4th, unfortunately, could not make it, so we'll have to make do with John, Paul, and myself. Willie here on the line. And really, to begin, I'd love to ask my co-hosts, what keeps them coming back to this question of quality? I think that's a fair question, given how much time it's year 4 of this investigation into the nature of quality, an interdisciplinary investigation into the nature of quality, hopefully executed practically. We are, and I do think I speak for all of us when I say we're interested in living these questions. We're interested in solving problems in the real world. We may all have been tempted at some point or other to disappear into a cave for a few years and seclude ourselves from the madness of this world, which in many ways is somewhat lacking in quality. So no, we're interested in living in the world, in experiencing quality in our day-to-day lives, and in sharing what we're learning. So guys, why the hell do we keep coming back to this stuff? I mean, surely, I don't know, surely there's a limit.
Well, my brief frame on everything is truth is how the world really works, and wisdom is aligning our actions to truth. So I think of this as a giant exercise in unconcealing truth. And the better we can understand truth, and the better opportunity we have to align our actions to it, which is wisdom.
What does quality have to do with truth, John, in your experience?
I often say quality with a capital Q, meaning, I mean, maybe this is somewhat the Socratic frame, but there's the idea of there are things that are good, and then there's the idea of kind of capital G, good. And so in the same way, I think there are things that are quality. I don't know, this drinking glass that I have is good enough. It's lasted for a decade, but it's, it'd be hard to call it beautiful. It'd be hard to call it, sort of unconcealing truth. It's more just practical, and it does a simple job well. But I think we all share a belief that there is, there's something at the bottom of the well, which is capital Q quality, which is, I often think of it is the good, the true, and the beautiful. And this is a lifelong pursuit to get a little closer to it.
Yeah. The other piece around quality and truth is, I think we live in a world where there's an accelerating kind of rate of quote unquote truths. That's marketing departments, that's products that claim they're one thing and practically they're something very different. And then even in the investor world, that applies the same, and in entrepreneurial circles as well. And I find the idea of what's true often comes back to what is consistently valid. Were we 30 years out from now and looking back at ourselves, what ultimately remains true over time consistently, if done consistently? And there's something about that is a very practical feedback loop, but quite certainly for me anyway, is a massive blind spot around the idea of, well, we live in a world now where cognitive theory is everywhere. You can Google whatever and they'll give you all the theories in the world, and you can go to fancy schools and they throw a bunch more at you. But in reality, those who know, and they tend not to have the AI determine the theory that's thrown at you as a truth. They tend to have that lived truth. And I think the difference between those two pathways are very clear when you're building something, but they're very unclear when you're away from that part of the process. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Well, I think this aphorism has come up in conversations. And I think it comes up, certainly conversations we've had, and I think it comes up a lot because it's so central to this project that I feel we are dedicating an increasing chunk of our lives to. And I think it speaks directly to what you're suggesting, Paul. The aphorism is from Nassim Taleb's book, The Bed of Procrustes. And he, in this book, has a couple of lines to the effect of, the problem with knowledge is that there are more books about birds written by ornithologists than there are books about birds written by birds. And so there's a few things that really sort of touch me with this. And that is that the birds just fly. Birds just dynamic, we could call that, Persig's terminology, dynamic quality. Dynamic quality is often beyond words. Great practitioners don't feel the need often to have a theory to explain to the world why they've built something beautiful or how they can do something beautiful. They often just do it. And maybe theory, it's not to knock theory. Theory can be beautiful, but that's what I was hearing in your words, Paul, is that there's something about lived experience that's really important here. There's something about practical action in the field that's really important here. There's something about attuning ourselves to stories that I think is as alive as ever, as far as I'm concerned, when we're on this quest, or as part of this quest understand quality more deeply, bring it into our lives, live it, practice it as a craft in our professional lives. So I think I'd also add to what John was saying that quality and truth, it feels like, in the same sense as you could say this about truth, quality is something you come into relationship with. It doesn't seem to be fixed. There's something about a process of attunement. As I reflect on the last couple of years of our conversations, quality can be something you can become more deeply attuned to. And it is a process of unconcealing, as far as I can tell, very much. That there is something out there. Yes, go ahead, John.
I'll give a really practical application here. So our friend Luca Delana, who's been on the show a couple of times, sent a note earlier, I think it was last week, and he commented that, here I'm quoting, a study on COVID papers found that 80% of papers which cite retracted research were published after the retracted date, which is terrifying, right? So if I use our language, we thought something was true. That was the publication of a paper. We subsequently learned it wasn't. We retracted it. And then people kept on to in great numbers, kept on citing things we now knew weren't true. And so if you think, what is the antidote to that? Well, one of the antidotes to that is being well attuned to what is most likely to be true. It's not the only antidote, but it's certainly one. And so, Paul, to your point on, the velocity of information is at such a high rate these days that it's impossible to keep up. Our antidote to being fooled, one of them is to be so close to the idea of capital Q quality that it's like, in banks in the old days, when you get trained as a bank teller, you would be forced to handle an enormous volume of cash, so that when something that was counterfeit money came through, you just sort of instinctively knew it. It felt wrong. You might not even be able to articulate why. It's. And so if we can handle as much capital Q quality as we can, then the imposters ought to become much more easy to spot.
I'm praying that some of it rubs off on me, guys. I think that's a big part of the adventure, as far as I'm concerned, is spending time with people that live it much more deeply than certainly I might. Paul, I saw you taking a breath.
No, I was just going to say, what comes to mind as we're talking about this is like Les Schwab's book on, he wrote it himself. It was after effectively his whole career. And he was like, this has to be in my language. It just needs to be the simple truths that I know that worked very well within my business. And it's kind of similar with our conversation with Peter and with Teresa on Costco, and, between Saul Price and Jim Senegal, there are many of these things that the truth is a dynamic truth because it's both right and wrong. It all depends on the context it sits within. And it sounds like we're kind of over intellectualizing that, but we're not. I think there's just, when you come from a world where it's unclear what's the, call it quote unquote capital Q quality truth, or the Les Schwab book, relative to every other business book that's is quoted as important, I think you start to actually see that there's a completely different journey that those folks who have this version of truth, and also this, frankly, wisdom to share, that there's a low volume, high signal type focus for them, where they'll only write 2 to 3 books. They don't need more, but ultimately those 2 to 3 are everything they have to say about the topic, and there's a full stop at the end. And they say that because
it's Paul. You can't mention the Les Schwab book without giving us, for those who haven't read it, what's one thing that stands out to you here on the subject of quality,
Les Schwab,
from a practitioner?
Yeah, I would say I'll let everybody read it themselves. But certainly the biggest idea that came out, I think he's a master in the quality of incentives within a system. So Les Schwab is famous for obviously a successful tire center business over the US, but he ultimately kept the model extremely simple at a franchise level, and just had really basically 4 metrics that drove his whole business up to the point of, call it, in the billions of revenue. And those metrics were both at a franchise level, so the actual general manager who was running the business knew every single day what his P&L looked like personally, and then what his teams looked like as well. And then all the way up to a business unit level, there was full transparency, how much everyone was making, what bonus structures were in place. And he just kept it extremely simple in a way that he basically had better retention than his whole industry. And the retention of his general managers, he was famous for having a service that effectively, if there was a, mom who turns up at a soccer van, he would make sure to pay as much attention to her 5-minute problem as somebody who comes in with a 10,000 euro tire problem, because he knows that the 5-minute problem is 10 times as valuable if I really solve it for that one soccer mom for their full lifetime as a tire center. And so he was famous for just choosing very specific moments where he could solve the problem for the client in a way that others didn't compete on. And he had them for life on the basis of having solved that one problem for the soccer mom who was on the way to the soccer match and she couldn't get there, but had a 5-minute solution she needed. And so the incentive side of his book is just an amazing kind of quality that you see in these businesses that really survive. But also the customer experience side, he has nuts and bolts and just simple kind of tweaks to his model where he could just outcompete everyone who tried to copy him. That industry is known for just copycats, but ultimately he chose where it was almost impossible to compete against him, because you can only, where you have a general manager who's bought in, compete for the soccer mom 5-minute problem, because it's a signal of how efficient all your culture is, that in that 5 minutes you can get exactly the service, the exact problem, attention, because all that type of good stuff. Nobody can actually, if they're running a business poorly, they can't compete in that 5-minute period. So it's almost a culmination, a fractal kind of culmination of the quality through his system.
That reminds me of, it sounds like he, maybe in his own words, he obsessed about compounding trust with clients. And I know he is known to say that people don't buy tires on price, they buy tires on trust. And if you compound enough trust, that's a very, very hard thing to compete with.
Over time. I think over decades, it just... There's a famous Irish story I know that we've talked about it, but Irish retailer, somewhat similar to Costco, but on a smaller scale. And he famously, when he was training the new guys coming in, called them 21-year-old. He's behind the deli counter, serving ham to the different customers. And he famously had to take the training every year. And the reason to take the training was he needed to impart one message. And that one message was, when you see the mom coming in doing the weekly shop, I need you to see the number 250 over their eyebrow. And the student obviously turns from why? And said, because it's 250,000 euro they'll spend in their whole life on groceries. So I'm either in that bucket or not. So sidetrack. Yeah. But there's some of these truths with a capital T that are signals of what is dynamically required in the system to even value that, right? And just a way of seeing that's different.
So let's talk about 2025. So we published more in this past year than in prior years. And Will, you mentioned we've been at this for 3 years, and we only started publishing, in the last probably year and a half. So what stuck out? What as we think back on the year, what kind of jumped out as, man, that really stuck with me?
Well, we published, I think, what maybe to any audience might seem to be quite a wild variety of conversations. The one that I'd love to bring up, and I would love to really ask Paul to share more about his experience. We had 2 episodes with musicians, one of which was with somewhat of a legend in the music community, a guy called Victor Wooten. And that was, as far as I'm concerned, I think one of my favorite episodes of last year of the show. And why that was the case for me was very much a function of Victor Wooten's, the quality of his presence. the quality he to me embodies a lot of what we're interested in. And that is, he is a practicing craftsman who has achieved globally recognized level of excellence in the practice of his craft. He is a master teacher. He has taken his lived experience and has made it possible for others to share in that and to help other practitioners of the craft of music. He has helped them evolve in ways that are, I think, reliably effective. So I have to say a lot of time for Victor Wooten. And I do think it'd be fun for our listeners to understand a bit more about how we can talk about Les Schwab and Victor Wooten within a 5-minute window, right? So Paul, what was it about Vic? Like you spent a lot of time preparing for that session. There was so much I took from it, but I'd rather hear from you about, what was the magic in that episode for you?
Yeah, I would say I probably, even re-listening to it now, I probably only appreciate about 20% of it. So I think it's going to be one that over time it matures quite well, because Vic just has so much experience at an artist level within his sphere, and then also at a universal level. So when Vic talks about nature, Vic isn't talking and saying, hey, I have a philanthropic venture and I'm looking to go ahead and do this. He is thinking deeply about what is intelligent about nature that I can then map into the craft that I know so well. And then how can I integrate it into the creativity of when I'm teaching with other students? And I think, to me, the conversation with Vic and just spending time, when you read his books, you'll see this. He puts so much care into the essence of what he's trying to communicate. And he's just such a fantastic communicator himself that the quality of clear communication comes through, obviously. But the quality that I think he has is he's so multidisciplinary and so open to other fields, other industries, other experts, being able to show him a clearer light on what's true in his field and in the things he deeply cares about. I think Vic is very unique in that. I don't know that many people. I know people who may talk about those concepts, but putting it into practice decade on decade, still touring, still hosting these nature projects, still trying to weave in the best teachers he can find, but also weaving nature's principles through into teaching music. He's still working against an industry in education where they basically tell him every day is wrong. And they say, this is the way it should be taught. And he just doesn't, that's not his lived experience. And he's just very brave, I think, and has a lot of courage to lead by example, but also to teach from a space of knowing in a different way that I think is generally acceptable about what he knows, about the kind of qualities in music. But John, you also I know you know Vic as well as anyone, so keen to get your view.
The thing that stuck out to me by far was you asked him about how to pay attention to the world around you. You asked him about creating music, about playing or performing music, about the business of music, about how to learn, about how to teach others, about nature. I mean, you poked at it from so many different angles, and he was so fluid in always coming back to, you could tell he has a core set of principles he deeply understands, where it almost doesn't matter what you're asking him about. Could be family, could be money, could be music, could be food. He's integrated this stuff, or will, to borrow your word, embodied this stuff in a way where he is reacting from a set of principles he so deeply understands that we could be talking about anything and he knows how to apply them, which is something, I mean, if you were to ask me what would I most love to imitate about Victor, it's getting to that point of fluidity with, here's how I believe things work and here's how I can then live out, I would call these values, live out those values in the world, regardless of the domain or discipline.
One of the things I love about his conversation is there's some patterns that just apply across all our conversations, and we'll obviously the quality of attention he pays when we think about Alison's conversation around what kind of, do you have a texture to your attention? Is it fine? Is it coarse? There are some parts of the conversation with Vic where you see that in practice, that like the idea of this guy who's peak in his silo, considering tracking almost the life unlock of the century. It's this fascinating thing that actually he studied ways of seeing in a completely different form and then reintegrates that every single year with one dedicated trip through nature where he goes tracking, and he invites all people along to come with him. But like, it's a very rare trait that you have folks being brought in on that, and also that you have the master who is studying other ways of seeing in other different types of disciplines and then weaving it in the same way as he did.
It feels very powerful. The quality of his presence, his openness, his playfulness, the extent to which he is unencumbered. He's literate in theory, but not a prisoner of it, not encumbered by mental models or concepts, or he's there. And that to me it was a great privilege to listen to that conversation as an example, I think, of someone that really, just for me, just embodies a lot of what we're trying to learn about, and bring more of into the world, which is excellence lived in a context appropriate way. And there's so little bullshit. It's so refreshing to listen and spend time with someone who's just alive and very real and gets things done. And gets them done, I think, in quite a playful, beautiful way. But if there's something that remains alive to me about this project that we're involved in here, it's that there's something about being in the world that feels really important. There's something about giving a toolkit to practitioners, I think. And by the way, there's, let's be honest, there's a deeply self-interested component to this, right?
Yeah.
Which we certainly would not want to hide. I am interested in acquiring more tools to be more present, to participate more fully, to participate more creatively, to add more value to the ecosystems I exist in. And I respect you guys very much as co-pilots on this adventure, because you care about the same things.
There's a clear, really, I think this is fair to say of all our guests, the wisdom they share is born out of practice, which is another way to say success is iterative. And so if you sort of consider, I think there's still a very large number of people in the world who think the way to deal with the world is to think about or conceptualize the perfect thing and then go act with it. There's a very different camp of people who think the thing to do is go do it a lot. And from that, I'll get good. You see this in business, you see it in music, you see it in writing, you see it in philosophy, you see it all over the place. But it is true that I think that a thread in what we found to be very precious and the little bit of truth we've unconcealed is it's born out of practice. It's born out of, Victor, I forget the number, but he's put out many, many, many albums that are his, and then he's played on many, 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 many more. And so in some ways, it's unsurprising if you just took that to say, well, it'd be hard not to end up as a master of a craft if you'd actually iterated that much with that many people in that many different domains and chosen to not just be excellent at an instrument, but also music more broadly, and then tracking, and then teaching. And then, if you think of all that as iterations, he has probably not just a few more iterations, but maybe many, many, many more iterations than most of the folks that some might consider his peers. And unsurprisingly, we find in someone who's iterated that much, a real master of a craft.
John, one of the other conversations I really, really enjoyed this year is our power law conversation. And you introduced the concept of like living your life through an experimental lens. And so obviously there's an approach in nature where effectively nature is just running as many experiments as possible, and whatever works it keeps and whatever it doesn't it disposes of. You, as an idea through your conversations, even I know from an investment perspective, this applies in the same sense. Like, how do you see that put into practice? Like, what does that mean to you in practice as an idea, which is easy to say but hard to do.
Yeah. So over my right shoulder here, which you can't see, is a card that's been on my wall for a while, which says success is iterative, so iterate. And it was one of those things where once I saw it, I could not unsee it. So you're right. In studying nature, I know you and I have talked extensively about nature, and one way to perceive nature is as trillions of experiments running at any given time. And then, of course, if you look at how anything's evolved, an organism, a forest, whatever, you'll see through the change, the algorithm for change, as you say, was things were tried, the things that worked were kept, the things that weren't were deleted. And so then this becomes fractal in a sense where you can zoom out at the level of the universe and see just an infinite number of experiments running at any given time. You can zoom into our planet. You can zoom into our species. You can zoom into a business. When I'm analyzing a business, one of the things I look at is this business iterating quickly or slowly? And that's actually a very practical and pretty easily answerable thing. And if you're trying to figure out, are the odds that this business continues to do well or does well in the future, what are they? Well, a key ingredient to that is, are they sort of just resting on their laurels, or are they iterating? And then of course the output of continued iteration is power law distributions, which is a lot of what we talked about in that episode. But with Eric, so one of my favorite explorations of this year was being part of Eric Markowitz's journey to write this book Outlast and answer this wonderful and difficult question of why do a few things last for hundreds or thousands of years and most things don't. And so as part of that, we recorded a couple of episodes we published here. He and I also ended up in Geneva, Switzerland, where he's trying to go around the world. I think he's clocked up a couple 100,000 air miles to go actually spend time with things and people and places that have outlasted. And so we're in Geneva, Switzerland. It's the global head of high-end watchmaking. And we spent time with the curator of the Patek Philippe Museum. We spent time at a school for watchmakers who trains the next generation of watchmakers, incidentally supported by the watchmaking world itself. We spent time in some of the boutiques just observing the product, learning about the history. And in all that, you see this idea of success as iterative. I mean, you can literally feel it, where you go to the Patek Philippe Museum, which is one of the most beautiful museums I've ever been to. They have 500 years of timepieces in one building, and you can go look at a timepiece worn by Marie Antoinette, or timepieces even older or even younger, and you can see the change in what we even use timepieces for. Originally, timepieces were just ornamental, and it didn't even matter if they kept accurate time. It was almost an excuse to have more jewelry. But you can see as you look at these things that through iteration, they got more beautiful. Through iteration, the craft improved. Through iteration, timekeeping got much, much, much more accurate. Through iteration, we found new ways of doing things. Through iteration, we found ways to both make timepieces affordable for the masses. Originally, they were just for the ultra wealthy. So through iteration, you can see all this. And if I summarize that in a phrase, we were speaking with the head of the watchmaking school we were at, and he said the thing we try to do here, and he was talking about the valley that that Geneva's in. The thing we try to do here is respect tradition, and there are several hundred years of tradition in that valley of watchmaking, and support innovation. And from all that, and from all the conversations with Eric, at least for me so far, that's the line: respect tradition, support innovation. Those 4 words, I think we could spend the rest of our lives figuring out exactly what all that means. But embedded in that is the idea that if you just rest on something that you already have, your risk of obsolescence, I think, goes up. But equally, if all you try to do is innovate and you don't respect what came before you, you lose the wisdom embodied in the things that came before you. And if you can somehow get that balance or that equation right, that gives us the opportunity to continue to improve while receiving the benefits of what came before us as well.
Yeah. It reminds me of our conversation with Tom in a way, this idea of like these things whisper, they're subtle nudges, and they're subtle metrics or subtle knowings that you only develop over time in certain fields. That idea has really kind of changed my year in many ways is like, look out for the subtle around this thing and how people are building, whether it's, the Steve Jobs, is he checking the back of the TV cabinet, or if it's, an artist, are they signing their own work? All those subtleties, it's a very different, the conversation with Tom kind of in a big way made me pay attention through very small, unusual elements of somebody's process.
I'll give you
the
a
idea of
practical one.
awareness. Yeah.
Sorry to cut you off. A practical one, and then we'll keep moving. So I found myself recently in need of a minor surgery. And so I had the problem of, okay, how do you pick a surgeon? And, you have surgery every so often, right? But for the first time in my life, at least, I kind of thought, okay, I need a surgeon who respects tradition and supports innovation. What I don't want is a surgeon where I'm the first person she's operating on, right? There's not enough time to build up the skill and the wisdom and so on. Equally, I don't want a surgeon that's done this for 40 years, but is only using technique they learned 40 years ago. And so I've been trying to figure out, okay, how do you can't just pick an older surgeon or a younger surgeon. Actually, what you're trying to optimize for is some version of they respect tradition, they've embodied the wisdom that came before them, and also they are adding to that. They're supporting innovation. And it was just one of those completely out of left field. And I realized, actually, this is the piece of this Art of Quality project. What is capital Q quality? I'm porting it right over into finding a surgeon. Yeah.
I'm intrigued, Willie. Like, you've taught so much about the idea of awareness. Definitely a lot more than me. For you in 25, like what excites you about the idea of awareness as you move in to call it the next year of building in all parts, both on the business side and also team side?
Well, it really touches everything for me. It's at the heart of the whole project. And it won't surprise you guys to hear me say that whether I've got conversations planned with investors, business operators, what you could call wisdom keepers, so practitioners in a variety of wisdom traditions. And the more I think about it, the more important to me it has become. And if we go back to what we were saying earlier about quality as being something that one comes into relationship with, it seems that the obstacles to quality are, you encounter this in modern culture, a huge amount of obstacles that stand in our way of this experience of unconcealing, this experience of coming into relationship with quality. We're often caught up in our own heads. We're lost in concepts. We're prisoners of our own use of language. If language is a layer that sits on top of reality that we use to interface with reality, which is really what it is, right? Language is by definition one step removed from the action. The moon is not the word moon. Quality is not the word quality. I think that's one thing we can be sure of, right? And by that, I mean, to extend that point sort of facetiously, anything that claims that it is high quality is probably not that. So I think we have a problem, gents, with the title of our podcast. but that's a topic for another day. No, I jest. So it's central to the investigation this year. What is central? The speaking to master practitioners about the quality of attention they bring to their work and getting them in a place where they feel safe and comfortable to talk and to tell stories about how they attend to their work. And I'll bring in, it's hard, in fact, impossible to answer this question without bringing in someone that I think we're all fans of to some degree or other, and that's the work of Ian McGilchrist. It's his framing of the question of attention in the context of the way in which our brain operates and the way in which our different parts of our brain experience and attend to the world differently. The left hemisphere being more prone to experience the world as separate, discontinuous, as something that is to be acted upon. The right hemisphere being more prone to see the world as interconnected, the right hemisphere is much more at home in the implicit, in the embodied, in the experienced. And it feels like that is really the home of a lot of quality that we are seeking. It's a kind of quality that Victor Wooten embodies in his work and in his presence. And at the same time, I think, as you were saying, John, I get very excited about where that right hemispheric open awareness, deeply attuned to the environment, deeply contextually attuned, connected to really across time and space to lineages of practice that are embodied in the hands of a watchmaker that's been poking at dials and crafting these components for decades and fitting them, that there's a lived tradition in those hands, where that intersects with left hemispheric ways of attending and knowing. There's something, I think, to me about this project of that to go anywhere near anything interesting as far as we're concerned, there has to be some kind of synthesis. Yeah. And that's, to me, where I think the master practitioners that I think we're all interested in spending time with, we're all interested in platforming, we're all interested in sharing stories from, that there's something about let me put it this way, avoiding the trap of fetishizing either left or right hemisphere, avoiding the trap of either fetishizing, what can be measured, which is beautiful, with what can't, right? Mm-hmm. John, you mentioned the good, the true, and the beautiful earlier, right? I think that's a big part of this, that a lot of what is most meaningful in life is very hard to measure, and yet measurement is wonderful, right? Can we continue this investigation in the spirit of synthesis? And that's the Paul's question on this question of attention. It's alive to me. It's as live as it's ever been. I continue to enjoy and really benefit from McGilchrist's framing. And McGilchrist, the big prize in his work being right, left, right, that we start with open awareness. We start with embodied awareness. There's a whole series of conversations I had this year about what does it mean to sort of clean up and improve the quality of our ability to attend with open awareness. The left hemisphere comes in beautifully, and that example, I think I'd give the example of the piano player, right? Where you listen to the piece, you listen to your Mozart or your Bach. You have no chance of learning the piece unless you've really listened to it in your body. You then get into the notes, you study the notes, you break the piece apart into components, you go segment by segment, and then you mustn't forget to throw the notes out the window. And come back to playing the piece, connected to the whole tradition of the piece that you hold in your body, all that intelligence, a lot of which is unconscious, really. If you've attained any degree of mastery, the unconscious plays a big role. Mm-hmm. So,
and I think it's fair for us to say that we are, one read on the last few hundred years of human history has been a pretty rapid vector towards more and more and more left hemisphere and less right hemisphere. And so I know part of the reason we end up often in the right hemisphere domain is we have a shared conviction that we deeply need more of it, that we're out of balance. I love the piano example. I agree. I think about traditions in music like bluegrass, where there are songs, but if you take a song like St. Anne's Reel or just any of the classics, you'd probably be hard-pressed to find actually a physical copy of music that just said, here's every note. It's a jam, it's a recognizable harmony, it's a recognizable melody, but there's no definitive answer. It's more a tradition you got to get into, and you only get into it by playing it. On a really practical note, I mean, last night I was putting my son to bed, and I was sort of in this mode of, let's say, just got to get things done. Very left hemisphere, got to tick things off the list. And we were having a great deal of fun, more than we normally do, just chatting while it's bedtime, and notionally I should be turning the lights off and walking out. And I started to sort of wind down our conversation. And then I zoomed out, and some of the stuff we talk about with attention, in my head, the soundtrack that was playing was, I'm not paying attention to the right things. And I kind of reweighted in a way, time with my son is literally the stuff I want life to be about. And yet I was so sort of in this tick things off a list, left hemisphere, dominate reality mode that I was just trying to get to the next thing on the list. And I don't think I had the ability to even sense how much that's going on until we really started to get into the art of quality of paying attention. And of course, knowledge is the beginning of the opportunity to invite wisdom. So, I'm sort of terrified by all the ways that I'm behaving in that manner and not aware of it. But I'm seeing cracks start to open where we can reroute
to the club.
Attention. Yeah, right.
That's it. With a bit of luck, I think studying this stuff intensely enough might get us a bit closer to the action. Well, I think that's I think for today, to our dear listeners, was to give you a sense for what is alive to us, some of what we picked up from really wonderful people we spent time with last year, and a bit of what to expect over the coming year. And I wonder for you, John, maybe leave us with a reflection on what you are really excited to investigate in 2026. What is alive to you?
In a phrase, putting these things in practice. And I'll answer that through a story. So I was once listening to a sermon by Tim Keller, who's a Presbyterian minister in New York City. He's since passed, but he commented that he hit a point in his life where he had read so much of the writings of C.S. Lewis. He'd read them over and over and over for decades, that it got to the point where, it used to be he read them and thought they were, he learned a lot. And then over the years, he read them and he would start to reference them. If he had a question, he would say, did Lewis ever speak to that? And he'd look it up. But then eventually he got to a point where a question, even one that Lewis never directly addressed, the question could be posed, and he sort of knew how Lewis thought. And so he sort of knew what Lewis would say, even though Lewis wasn't there and his writings didn't directly address it. And I kind of view a similar thing. I hope we're all kind of nudging our way towards, at some point, this stuff is embodied in a way where we sort of know the answer to the question, even if the question's never been directly asked. And so in a practical sense for me, things like, what is the rate of iteration inside a business? I practice the craft of investing, and I've never seen any report anywhere that said, hey, amongst the important things you need to know about this business is its speed of iteration. Just never seen that. But that seems deeply practical to me. And so, in my own ways, we're making an attempt to answer that question. And other things like that, where there are things that I think are just full of wisdom and just congruent with the reality that we're in. Power laws is another one where, we know it's the structure that a handful of relationships, a handful of conversations, a handful of ideas, a handful of investments, a handful of things carry an enormous amount of weight in your life. And yet we're in a world that largely deals in averages and largely sort of, pushes things like grow the number of relationships you have, maybe a little bit more than grow the depth of the relationships you have. And so, I see all these practical ways where, whether it's investing or whether it's relationships or so on, application of practical wisdom is back to what we're studying, get closer to capital Q quality and then put it in practice. So in investing, that's rate of iteration in businesses, and, the compounding trust we mentioned earlier, things like that, where this is starting to become very practical for me. And that's what 26 is going to be about.
Beautiful. Paul, tell us a little bit about what you are excited about for 2026.
Yeah, I think in simple terms, it's continuing to refine the so what out of a lot of what we are working through within the project. So that's everything. I think in many ways, we've gone through the demise of pulling together what we thought quality was, destroying 90% of the ideas, and there's kind of 10% of them that are stuck with each one of us. And I think in each one of our kind of areas, I'm really excited to be able to see what 10% actually stick over time. And then actually, for me, learning how John is able to see them in the worlds that he operates. The same with you, Will, and actually the same with Fetty. And just being able to see across the different worlds, what qualities are hard to see, but are disproportionately important. And so one of the biggest ideas with what I'm excited about is really the idea of kind of the value of a network. How do you determine the depth of relationships in a network? How do you determine the depth of kind of the wisdom of the network over time? How does that mature over time? And I'm just noticing more and more that there are certain networks of both in nature, but also actually more applicable to the investment world and to business world. There are certain relationships that drive a lot of the behavior, and John is obviously researching a ton of that. But I'm finding new language within those. I'm really excited to see what language you guys use for those types of ideas, because having tried to distill it down to simple, I've struggled this year to try and find that. But I'm really looking forward to kind of next year being able to find why certain networks are much more dynamic, and frankly, how the intelligence goes across certain networks much quicker, much more efficiently, much simpler. Why trust can be a leading indicator of certain things that allows for, rapid experimentation, to use John's word. So I think I'm really excited to get to that phase, because in the systems part of the AOQ kind of deep dive, that's going to be one of the most important kind of areas that I'm just going to try and find language for the qualities that exist within the idea. And I just think that the idea of networks is pretty much everyone thinks it's a science idea, but most business people have a word similar for it. But I'm not finding it in practical use a huge amount. So yeah, if there's anybody out there,
it's underneath everything. Yeah. It is genuinely underneath it. All the math of power laws is network math.
Say more. Like, what does that mean? Like,
well, I think we're going to have to save this for a full episode. I actually feel it's deeply appropriate to leave to leave our audience with a quote to the effect: "Life did not take over the globe by combat, but by networking." It feels like networks are going to be very important for all of us this year. And I'm so excited to explore all of this with you guys, and want to thank our listeners for being along for the ride.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Hopefully,
thank you, Darian, for
some of it comes
keeping
across.
us moving, producing it. Yeah. No, it's exciting.
Yeah, let's a big thank you to our producer as well, who's doing some magic behind the scenes, and who maybe we'll hear more from this year.
Absolutely.
Stay tuned.
And Fetty, of course.
Yes.
Couldn't be here today.
Yes.
Thank you for listening. And for more resources, please visit our website, theartofquality.co.